masuk ke Lektri Dharma.
Assalamualaikum. Samsul. Ada Daniel. Ini Uma ya? Suhani Dewi.
Iya, Bu Witri.
Apa kabar di sana?
Baik, alhamdulillah. Apa kabar juga?
Alhamdulillah.
Sehat ya.
Allah. Di sana udah tenang ya, Uma ya? Kamu di ini ya, di bareng sama Nehi? Bukan ya? Bukan satu kota ya? Di Monash ya? Oh iya, di Sydney deng ya, bareng Pak Bambang ya?
Ya, Pak Bambang.
Oke.
Lancar kan?
Pak
Bambang forward juga ke grup kami.
Oh ya?
Ya, mohon doanya. Semoga nggak lupa bergabung dia.
Ya. Ya Allah. Di sana kafe tuh udah aman ya, Uma ya?
Masih ada, ya 1-2 aja.
Ya, udah nggak pakai masker berarti?
Mandatory aja. Masih
I
harus,
see.
kalau di tempat-tempat umum kayak apa namanya, public transportation masih harus. Lumayan pajaknya.
Tadi
Kalau
kampus enggak ya?
kalau
Udah terbuka? Udah dibuka kampusnya?
masih online. Mungkin semester ini akan sudah masuk, cuman ya masih online tapi rasa di kampus gitu aja. Di kelas tapi masih harus pakai Zoom, jadi malah double.
Ya.
Ya begitulah.
Sukses
semuanya.
deh, keren
Nanti.
perjuangannya.
Ya, amin,
Anak-anak
amin.
lancar kan?
Amin, lancar,
Udah bisa
alhamdulillah.
mengikuti.
Udah sekolah, kalau anak-anak mah sekolah udah masuk aja.
Oh ya? Oh, untuk anak-anak sudah ya, children.
Iya. Iya, karena
Di
orang
US
tua kan
aja
banyak
anak-anak
yang
udah
kerja.
masuk. Iya.
Pak Witri.
Ya, halo Pak.
Siapa? Mbak Mirjam mau gabung pas jam 30.
Oke, 30.
Ya, pas
1.30 ya?
Ya.
Oke.
Nanti mungkin tadi bilang khawatir cuman kalau jam 13.30 belum banyak. Mungkin toleransi 1-2 menit, 5 menit gitu.
Oke, ya.
Nggak apa-apa.
Soalnya di flyernya itu 13.30 ternyata.
Oke, ya. Hujan deras sekali.
Masuk baru berapa? Baru 11 orang. Aduh, ya Allah, astaga.
Apa Pak Samsul? Ngantuk?
Hah, Pak Ubed nih, gimana Pak Ubed?
Udah makan belum?
Udahlah. Nah, Pak Wildan ini udah makan apa belum ini? Kok kayaknya kelihatan kayak lapar dia. Jam berapa nih mau mulai ini? Pak Ubed, ini umum kan?
Iya.
Mau disebar nggak apa-apa?
Ya, nggak apa. Kita mulai 13.30.
Oke, siap. Alhamdulillah.
Ini udah mulai ya? Ini cara lebu, ini masuk lebu nih Mas?
Ini kok suaranya era ini.
Aku mau ngetok bener. Oh, jadi aku harus lebu?
Udah.
Oh, no. Caranya?
Berpandangan.
Pak Samsul,
Ya.
nanti orang Madura harus bertanya ini. Berikutnya orang Madura kok.
Nah, udah ada yang masuk, ini tak sebar loh Pak.
Iya.
Samsul nih, Jos. Ini Pak Samsul.
Disebar di komunitas Madura, Pak Samsul.
Udah, nanti banyak yang masuk ini ke kampus-kampus di Madura udah.
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 Iya.
Datanya Arab Madura nih.
Ini masuk YouTube juga nggak ini Pak?
Masuk.
Oke, oke.
Linknya belum dikasih karena ini biar penuh dulu aja. Ini masih banyak.
Ya, tadi ada yang tanya juga sih teman dari UIN kalau nggak salah itu. Minta link YouTube-nya, tapi saya bilang join dulu gitu.
Ya, ini masih. Tapi nanti kita atau mau disebar di mana, Mbak? Kita kasih di Adia. Saya kirim di Adia ya, Pak Ubed.
Ya, boleh.
Mbak Hira nganggo cadar.
Nggak bisa ya.
Lele mangut. Lele mangut.
Oh. Ya kok nggak bisa ya?
Ruang dosen timur ada makanan banyak.
Mbak Era.
Disambi ya Mbak Witri, tak makan dulu ya.
Oke.
Monggo, monggo.
Pak Ubed.
Kok suaranya kecil atau biasa?
Pak Dekan nanti.
Saya bisa
Pak Dekan
dibantu.
ada sambutan?
Oh iya, nggak usah Mbak Witri.
Langsung ya?
Langsung aja, iya.
Okay.
Ini siapa? Hostnya siapa?
Bu panitia, panitia tuh. Bu Leli ya?
Ya. Tolong Pak host.
Gimana ya yang mau dijadikan co-host siapa?
Bu Fitri, Pak Ubed, saya juga bisa biar nanti kalau ada yang bersuara bisa membantu. Panitianya siapa ini? Siapa Pak Ubed?
Itu ada Mbak Leli sudah ada di situ kepanitiaan.
Oh iya Pak.
Yang mau dijadikan co-host siapa?
Ya tolong.
Pak
Ubed, saya juga bisa biar nanti kalau ada yang bersuara bisa.
Oh iya Pak, siap.
Membantu. Panitianya siapa ini?
Ini udah kok.
Siapa Pak Ubed?
Itu ada Mbak Leli sudah ada di situ kepanitiaan.
Oh iya Pak.
Yang mau dijadikan co-host siapa? Pakai nama panitia.
Saya juga bisa biar nanti kalau ada yang bersuara.
Oh iya Pak, siap. Di situ ya. Masalah mau host.
Masalah gabung nggak? Salah.
Dan perawatannya kami loh kayak banyu dan mangut tapi malah bagus.
Itu sudah akan masuk Mbak Adri. Selamat siang Mbak Mirjam.
Selamat siang.
Apa kabar?
Baik, apa kabar di Jogja?
Ya, baik. Ya. Sehat Mbak Mirjam sekarang?
Alhamdulillah sudah lumayan sehat, ya.
Oke,
Saya mungkin minum sedikit teh sambil bicara, masih sedikit sakit tenggorokan, tetapi ya alhamdulillah sudah lewat COVID.
Oh ya, ya alhamdulillah. Ini sudah ada beberapa orang Madura datang juga Pak, Mbak Mirjam.
Selamat datang.
Ya ini ada
Siapa yang
Pak Samsul itu, Samsul itu dari Madura.
Halo Pak Samsul.
Halo.
Apa kabar?
Alhamdulillah saya alhamdulillah beres. Bisa Madura juga. Lah. Bisa bahasa Madura.
Ya. Mek lecek Madura, Pak.
Hai.
Nanti pastinya Mbak Witriani ya.
Halo Ibu.
Halo, Mbak
Halo.
Mirjam, selamat bergabung, selamat datang di Jogja.
Terima kasih banyak.
Oke.
Senang sekali.
Kami yang banyak terima kasih Mbak Mirjam.
Sama-sama. Saya juga berterima kasih.
Saya menunggu bukunya dikirim dari
Iya, dari
Amerika ya, langsung ya.
ya. Itu sekarang banyak kiriman banyak terlambat karena ada salju di Jerman, ada corona, ada Brexit. Jadi buku itu juga dicetak di UK.
Oke ya.
Dan ada banyak masalah antara perbatasan Inggris-Jerman atau Inggris dengan Eropa.
Oke. Semoga segera sampai. Harus mereview ya.
Ya, bagus. Pak, saya bisa share screen?
Oh iya. Mbak panitia, co-host, bisa Mbak Mirjam dibuatkan sebagai co-host.
Oh iya Pak, iya.
Oke, mungkin bisa dimulai ya Mbak Mirjam.
Baik.
Silakan Mbak Witri.
Ya, kita mulai.
Ya.
Oke. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Yang terhormat, probably I will talk in English or campur-campur ya Ibu Mirjam.
Oh, Mirjam Bu Mirjam pakai bahasa Madura.
Oke, iya Pak. Iya.
Nanti saya yang
terjemah. Iya, yang terhormat Ibu Mirjam Lücking, ya dari Hebrew University, Pak Dekan Fakultas Adab, Bapak Muhammad Wildan, Pak Wakil Dekan bidang 1, bidang Pak Ubed, ada Pak Uki. Selamat dan juga teman-teman semuanya, ya, selamat bergabung pada Bi-Weekly Forum Fakultas Adab dan Ilmu Budaya UIN Sunan Kalijaga. Sekarang kita kedatangan tamu istimewa, the special guest from Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Maybe saya sedikit membacakan CV ya sebelum Bu Mirjam untuk she's anthropologist who focus on mobility and globalization, intercultural encounters, religion and politics, and her current research interest concern on relationship between Indonesia and the Middle East. Jadi spesialisasinya adalah tentang Indonesia dan Middle East. She got her PhD from the University of Februari. But since October 2019, she is a member of Martin Society of Fellow in the Humanities and Social Sciences in Jerusalem. And then previously, she did a doctoral fellowship at the Department of Asian Studies at Hebrew University of Jerusalem, with the Center of the Study of Conversion and Interreligious Encounters at Ben Gurion University of the Negev. And then yang lainnya adalah some of the works, beberapa karyanya antara lain Image of Authentic Muslim Self, Gender Moralities and the Construction of Arab Others in Contemporary Indonesia, Walking in Mecca, How Informal Pilgrimage Migration from Madura, Indonesia to Saudi Arabia Challenge State Sovereignty, Beyond Islam, Nusantara and Arabization, Capitalizing Arabness in Madura, East Java, and also Arabness in Social Capital in Madura. Mostly talk about Madura. It's interesting. And then she speaks in Arabic, English, French, Hebrew, German, and also Indonesia. Okay. You speak a lot of language, Mirjam.
Bahasa Madura lagi, Pak.
Ya, tambah Madura ya, plus Madura. Oke. Sekarang kita bicara tentang his latest publication about a part of her PhD thesis that berjudul Indonesian and Their Arab World, Guided Mobility Among Labor Migrants and Mecca Pilgrims, which explore the way contemporary Indonesians understand the relationship to the Arab world. Of course, there are many things to discuss here. Jadi banyak hal yang bisa kita elaborasi tentang kajian serta temuan buku-buku khususnya dalam Indonesian and the Arabic world. Dan untuk menyingkat waktu, silakan Ibu Mirjam untuk talk about your book. Terima kasih.
Terima kasih banyak Ibu Witriani. Terima kasih banyak Pak Wildan untuk undangannya. Selamat siang Bapak-Bapak, Ibu-Ibu. Saya sangat terhormat saya boleh bicara hari ini tentang buku saya. Ya, saya akan bicara dalam bahasa Inggris. Saya minta maaf, saya kemarin masih sedikit sakit dan itu untuk sementara lebih mudah untuk berbicara dalam bahasa Inggris, tetapi kalau nanti ada pertanyaan dalam bahasa Indonesia, saya sangat senang berdiskusi dalam bahasa Indonesia. Kalau untuk bahasa Madura saya harus minta maaf, saya sudah banyak lupa. Oke, baik. Jadi kita bicara sedikit tentang buku saya. Ini buku saya. Semoga dalam waktu dekat juga ada di Indonesia. Untuk sementara ada juga e-booknya. So I hope soon the book will also arrive in Indonesia. Okay, I will talk a bit about the book, and then I will also share my screen to show some photos and to tell you more about the research. I think for you, for an audience of one of the most important Islamic universities in Indonesia, I don't need to say so much about the background. Dunia Arab di Indonesia, Arabisasi. I think many of you know about the ambivalence of Arabness or the Arab world in Indonesia or in any Muslim society. Of course, historically, the Arab world is the birthplace of Islam. It is home to the holy sites in Mecca and Medina and to important scholarly centers. And Arabic language is the language of the Quran, of the Revelation, a sacred language. But then again, to be Muslim is not to be Arab. Not all aspects of Arabic or Middle Eastern culture and customs are part of the Sunnah of being Muslim. For me, as an anthropologist, someone who is interested in culture and society, I was keen to understand how ordinary people in Indonesia, in everyday life, kehidupan sehari-hari, in the largest Muslim society in the world, relate to the so-called historical heartland of Islam, and how they deal with ambivalences of what is called Arabisasi or Arabness, especially people who have actually traveled to the Arabian Peninsula, and what they represent of the Arab world when they return home to Indonesia. So labor migrants and Mecca pilgrims, tenaga kerja wanita, dan para haji, represent two different groups in Indonesian society. And yet, some pilgrims are migrants, and many migrants do in fact become pilgrims at some point. So on the one hand, migrants and pilgrims look like two contrasts, but then there is also connections and in many cases also similarities. I want to start by reading part of the introduction of the book, and then I will say more about the background and about the research process and the findings. So I start the book by asking, Dunia Arab punya siapa? Whose Arab world is it? Several times during my inquiry into the engagement of Indonesians with the Arab world, I heard a variation of the following joke. Why were so many prophets in the Middle East and so few in Indonesia? The witty Indonesian punchline was that people in the Middle East needed prophets to teach them how to behave, while in Indonesia people were already well-behaved and good-hearted. Many of my interlocutors also felt that had Mecca, the holiest place in Islam, been located in Indonesia, the country would have been flooded with pilgrims who would refuse to leave after discovering the beauty of Indonesia. This kind of commentary lies somewhere between irony and pride, with an element of self-mockery at Indonesia's location at the perceived periphery of the Muslim world, while at the same time suggesting that, as the most populous Muslim society in the world, a bit more attention could be paid to Indonesia. However, Indonesians are not only aware of the Arab world as it pertains to Islam, they also relate to Arab countries as destination for international labor migration. Many women from Indonesia's rural areas emigrate to Saudi Arabia, to the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, in search of socio-economic upward mobility.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
You haven't shared your screen.
Yeah, sebentar lagi.
Okay, yeah, sorry.
Yeah. Their encounter with the Arab world happens in the intimacy of private households, where they work and live as domestic workers. On airplanes from Indonesia to the Middle East, labor migrants and Mecca pilgrims might sit next to each other, although in many regions in Indonesia, their worlds barely overlap. For Indonesians who accomplish the pilgrimage to Mecca and Medina, the journey is an endeavor of spiritual fulfillment and participation in the global Muslim community, also personal prestige. Labor migration is by contrast associated with human rights violations, the ill treatment of migrant women, poverty, exploitation, and social tensions. And yet, Indonesians' views on the Arab world are not monolithic and are much more complex than these two contrasts might suggest. So I chose Migrants and Pilgrims because we can see many contrasting images of the Arab world in contemporary Indonesia on these two groups. But then again, it's also not monolithic. It's very, very complex. And the stories of migrants and pilgrims show these complexities. So asking like Dunia Arab punya siapa, or also to say in the title of the book, Indonesians and their Arab world, I mean, of course, the representations of the Arab world and the localizations of what is being made one's own once people are back in Indonesia. And as I've said, I'm an anthropologist. So as an anthropologist, I was not so much concerned with the theology or expert opinions, but more with everyday practices and ideas of Arabness among migrants and pilgrims. So I will now share my screen and say a bit more about how I came to research this topic. So yeah, first of all, this is the cover of the book. And as I said, like the personal pronoun, their Arab world relates to the representations, especially when people return from Arab countries. The research project was part of a larger research program at the University of Freiburg, where we had a big cluster on Southeast Asian studies, also with political science, with economy, with Islamic studies, and Anthropologie Budaya for my part. And my colleagues did research on images of the West, Dunia Barat, in Southeast Asia. And of course, during this whole project of world making in Southeast Asia, or to understand how people in Southeast Asia look at other parts of the world, as having myself studied Islamic studies and also Middle Eastern studies, I said it's important to understand about the ideas of the Arab world in Indonesia. The background, or what triggered my research interest, were also public controversies. I think many of you have seen memes like that are shared on social media, also other memes. So in public debates, there is sometimes a differentiation between Arabisasi and Islam, between culture and religion. What I said in the introduction, to be Muslim is not to be Arab. But then again, some of these public debates are more essentializing, and there is a difference between everyday life and lived religion among ordinary people and public debates, which are sometimes politicizing or essentializing. So I was interested in, as I said before, realities on the ground, everyday life, especially among people who had traveled to Arab countries. The two groups, labor migrants and Mecca pilgrims with whom I worked and who physically traveled to Arab countries, represent different segments of Indonesian society. I think now the Hajj is the most important reason for Indonesians' overseas travels. And also it is booming at the moment, and with a growing growing middle classes and people who can afford to travel. The waiting lists for the Hajj are very, very long. In Madura, up to 30 years and more. And so many people also do the small pilgrimage, the Umrah. So the pilgrimage to Mecca and Medina, the Hajj and the Umrah, represent spiritual fulfillment, but also the high expenses of given the high expenses. And for me as a social anthropologist being interested in the social dynamics, they also represent gengsi, social prestige, and the ability to travel. A sharp contrast to this is the reality of migrant women who mostly come from Indonesia's rural areas and who migrate in search of higher incomes working mainly as domestic workers in private households. And in this case, reports about abuse and exploitation can also create a negative image of the Arab world, a rather gloomy image. But as I've said in the introduction, sometimes these contrasts are not so clear. Many women who migrate as takeaway to the Gulf do perform the Hajj and Umrah. And in fact, there are also some cases of pilgrims entering Saudi Arabia on a pilgrimage visa and lastly staying to work. This is something that I was introduced to as Umroh Sandal Jepit. So to take a visa for the Umrah, for example, and then to stay and work. So furthermore, there are interesting similarities between migrants and pilgrims in terms of how these two groups become mobile. And this is something that triggered my interest on a theoretical level, discussing globalization more generally, and this aspect of guidance that is also in the title of the book, the guided mobility. So I was interested in how mobility happens, but also how some things are not mobile, how there can be immobility, and how people do become mobile, the guidance of mobility. And sometimes this guidance is more subtle, as you can see in these pictures. There can be an embodied element of guidance, like seragam, to wear uniform clothing, which gives people the feeling of togetherness and belonging to a group, guiding in a very embodied way, but then also traveling in a group, being guided by guides and intermediaries, by agents. So I suggest that in the overall way that mobility between Indonesia and the Middle East happens, guidance is a very important element. And I focused on the preparation and the return. So I did not, from like methodologically, I did not accompany migrants and pilgrims on their way to Saudi Arabia, but I focused on the preparation, for example, manasik, Hajj and Umrah, the personal preparation of spiritual preparation, the departure celebrations for migrant women, the recruitment and the training center. Bagaimana? Okay, and then also the return, what is being represented upon return. And for the return, I was also interested in the social mobility of having, for example, a higher social status after the return from the Hajj, returning as Haji or Hajja, and the higher social status from gaining higher incomes during labor migration. And then lastly, the question of how the spatial mobility, the physical mobility, the social mobility is related to cultural mobility in the sense of cultural changes or also changes of religious tradition. Again, in mind, this term of Arabisasi, is there a change in cultural and religious practice upon return, or is there a continuity? When I started to prepare this project, I was where you are at the moment. I was in Jogja, and when I said I'm interested in Arabisasi, budaya Arab di Indonesia, a lot of people in Jogja said, harus pergi ke Madura. Karena orang Madura mereka sedikit seperti orang Arab dan mereka sangat dekat dengan dunia Arab. So this was something surprising in the beginning of my research. And I did follow these claims. It was something that made me really curious. Ada apa sebenarnya di Madura? And I did a comparative study between Madura and Central Java, mostly in rural areas, in Jogja and its surrounding, but also in rural areas between Magelang and Salatiga, and then in various places in Madura, mainly in Pamekasan. So about Madura, there is a lot to say. I'm afraid that now in this context, I cannot spend a lot of time talking about Madura, even though I would like to. It's a fascinating topic and a fascinating community and island. But of course, many of the things that are being said about Orang Madura are also stereotypes. This is something that Huub de Jong wrote about a lot, that there is many stereotypes of the Madurese when it comes to masculinity, for example, aduan sapi, kerapan sapi, but also violence, like in this book of Latif Wiyata, but also in the book of Samsul Ma'arif, that the Charok tradition is something that the tradition of blood revenge, that a lot of people associate Budaya Madura with kekerasan, harshness, violence. And sometimes this is also connected to the harsh climate, to the economic activities, to tobacco farming and salt production. All of this leading to the stereotype or the assumption that orang Madura kasar, orang Madura ada kekerasan. And it was interesting that some people relate this also to the Arab, sifatnya orang Arab. But then again, also there is a strong piety in Madura, and the people in Madura are also being acknowledged and honored for this piety, for the tradition of very important Islamic scholarship, like this is Shaykhuna Khalil's grave, of course, the forefather of many important kiai in Indonesia. So, and then in comparison, of course, in another aspect, the adventurism, or what a lot of people in Madura told me is like the nekat of orang Madura, to be brave. And I like this saying, orang Madura berselimut, berbantal ombak dan berselimut angin, that there is a sense of outward merantau migration, of seafaring, and of being brave and exploring new places, which a lot of people in Madura said there is a long tradition of merantau, and of course merantau within Indonesia, but also to Malaysia and to Saudi Arabia. And because of this bravery, a lot of people in Madura know also how to handle Arab culture. So some people in pilgrimage business and pilgrimage travel agencies said, if you want a successful pilgrimage, you should involve someone from Madura, because the people from Madura, they know how to navigate and how to deal with the people in Saudi Arabia. Central Java, on the other hand, is a more heterogeneous environment. There is more of a mixture between different religions, a higher percentage of Christian communities. The so-called the villages that are known as Kantong TKW, that have a lot of female migrant workers, are closer to urban areas, to the big cities, to Salatiga, to Magelang, to Jogja. And there was, when I did my research, a lot of NGOs and labor migrant agencies, which offered also alternatives, that there was also a lot of migration to Korea, to East Asia. And many of the women with whom I worked, they had the choice. They could choose between different destinations of labor migration. They were comparing different countries of labor migration. And yeah, this heterogeneity also led to a different engagement with Arabness or with the Arab world. As for the methodology, it was an ethnographic research. All in all, I stayed more than a year, like 14 months in different places in Indonesia, mostly living in certain villages where I had contact partners. And like you see here in these pictures, of course, it involved to share the everyday life. If it would be like to prepare daun kelor, to help in the kitchen, to accompany families in the preparation and the return of pilgrimage and labor migration. I also was very much supported by research partners. So this is Hotim Ubaidillah, Mas Ubed, who was a very helpful research partner in Madura. And of course, for me as a woman, also sometimes not having access to the male sphere. So it was very helpful to have Mas Ubed as a research partner. Then, okay, in my book, this is something I wanted to say. In my book, everything is anonymized. It's I'm using pseudonyms for the research participants and also for the names of the villages where I stayed. So I mostly compare between two places. Gunung Embun is the name that I give to this research location in Jawa Tengah, and Ladang Tembakau is the name of the research location in Madura. So this is just nama samaran pseudonyms for the research location. The book is structured in 5 sections, starting, as I said before, with the question, whose Arab world is it? And what do I mean when I say Indonesians and their Arab world, like the representations and localizations? Not only talks about the Arab world, but also incorporating elements of Arabness, like clothing style, like the language, like music also in some cases. Then there is chapter 1 about the historical encounters between Indonesia and the Arab world, which also tackles ambivalences throughout history, leading to contemporary debates that I've mentioned earlier about Arabisasi, a lot also about Islam Nusantara, about globalized Islamophobia. And in this chapter, I also talk about Hadrami a little bit, but I must emphasize that the book is not about Hadrami, and of course, Hadrami have their own way of Arabness, which has been mixed and negotiated over centuries with Javanese and Indonesian culture. But that's something that Sumit Mandal or Martin Slama can say much more about. So it's not the focus of the book. The focus of the book is the everyday negotiations among labor migrants and Mecca pilgrims, and that's what I talk about in these in chapter 2, 3, and 4, the empirical chapters, and I will say more about each chapter now. So chapter 2 is titled The Beaten Tracks and Embedded Returns of Migrants and Pilgrims. With beaten tracks, I mean that the tracks are in a way not something new for many migrants and pilgrims. It is something that others have done before. They have heard from others doing the pilgrimage or migration before. And there are some narratives that come up again and again. And also the return is something that is being ritualized. There is a lot of celebrations in the context of return. So the tracks are beaten and the returns are embedded. So just to read this one quote among many quotes that appear in the book, but one quote that I like very much, where a Hajj returnee talks about the experience of doing the Hajj. So quoting, perbedaan hilang, zero. Nggak ada perbedaan sama sekali, bahkan kepada orang Shia, yang itu kadang-kadang Iran misalnya, jemaah dari Iran, hilang perbedaan-perbedaan. Bahkan sampai yang prinsip kayak Shia, itu hilang. Jadi di situ adanya saudara. Tidak ada perbedaan, sama sekali tidak ada. So this is one of the famous Hajj narratives, of course, also in other Hajj literature and research, that there is a feeling of the global ummah and the togetherness in Mecca, which is one of the most fascinating experience, as many of my research participants said. But then returning to Indonesia, upon return, there is often differences. And this is maybe a bit in the context of pilgrimage studies also, that of course there is a communitas or togetherness during the ritual and the pilgrimage, and upon return or after the pilgrimage there is often an emphasis on differences. And in this case, in the return context, that's the differences between the Hajj returnees and the people who stayed home, the people who have not yet done the Hajj, for example. So one of the concepts that I discuss in the book is the concept of Haji Mabrur, which you also see here in this banner, the hope of people returning as Haji Mabrur, as the pilgrimage being accepted by God, as virtuous returnees. And in my interviews and participant observation, I found that many pilgrims also feel that there is a social pressure of living up to this expectation of returning from the Hajj and sharing the wealth of the Hajj, not only the material wealth as someone who is able to afford the Hajj, but also the spiritual gain and the spiritual wealth. And the same is for the labor migrants who feel the pressure of living up to expectations of sharing economic gain that they gain through the migration abroad, but also the morality that sometimes there is rumors about what has really happened to these women. Was there violence? How did they earn this money? there is sometimes jealousy between migrant women, and then it is very important to stress the morality and moral values are a part of living up to these expectations, and they can also become part of representing the Arab world. In some cases, as you see here, the para haji would put on symbols, Arab dress, a white peji that would represent the prestige of the Hajj, and this could be labeled as Arab or as Arab symbolism, but then of course this works only within the embedded returns and what this means in the home context. In chapter 3, I talk more about the ambivalences and representations of what I call Arab others abroad and at home. And I discuss how the experiences of labor migrants relate to the broader discourse in contemporary Indonesian society. And here I profited a lot from the research with Effie Eliana from ANU, who researches on films and on media representations, where, for example, there is a lot of films like Ketika Cinta Bertasbih, where there is a romantic image of the Arab world, in contrast to, let's say, reports about ISIS and violence in the name of Islam, which relates to global Islamophobia that sometimes in Indonesia can also be an Arab phobia, that these things happen mainly in the Arab world or in the Middle East. And I want to read another quote from one of my research participants, in this case, a female labor migrant, TKW, who compares herself in comparison to Arab women. So she says, kalau yang perempuan yang Indonesia itu cantik, kalau di sana tidak dirawat, di sana paling kalau perempuan itu kerjanya cuma tidur, makan, tidur makan, jadi fisiknya tidak bagus. Tidak pernah kerja, jadi kendor-kendor kayak apa. Tidak pernah olahraga, cuma di rumah. Belanja sudah yang laki-laki, misalnya kalau belanja keperluan rumah. Perempuan tidak ada kerjaannya, cuma tidur punya anak. So I found that in the processing of how TKW talk about the time in the Arab world when they return home, it was a lot in a comparison to Arab others, to Arab women in this case, and to emphasize their own morality and also the moral superiority. So I found that these images of the Arab world are also gendered, and this is similar to what we see in the films like Ketika Cinta Bertasbih, where Indonesian female students in Cairo are represented as soft, gentle, and modest compared to Middle Eastern women. In chapter 4, I return to the micro level of individuals' processing of migratory experiences, and I look at some particularities and exemptions in the engagement with Arabness. And I sketch out two special cases, namely the TKW in this village that I call Gunung Ambon in Jawa Tengah, who in many cases reject the Arab world, who say, it's not good to go for labor migration to Arab countries. It's better to go to East Asia, to Korea, where the people are more like us, sesama Asia. So where in Jawa Tengah there was an emphasis on sesama Asia among TKW, whereas in Madura there was still a fondness of going to the Arab world and the pride, and a lot of TKI and TKW in Madura were proud that there is quite a large presence of Orang Madura in Saudi Arabia. So I just want to give you an example of two different stories of return, and I will read this again from the book. So this is two stories of return from two labor migrants, and I start with this Ibu, with this lady here, wearing this black t-shirt saying proud to be famous. And I call her Ibu Tati in the book. Ibu Tati welcomes me in fluent English and invites me into her brand new house made of concrete, painted in a cheerful yellow and equipped with new furniture. She leads me into the sitting room where guests are usually received and offers me a seat in the nicely arranged wooden suite. I notice the embroidery showing camels and pyramids on the big cushions lying on the sofa. On the walls, there is more decoration, souvenirs from her time in the Gulf states, including a picture of Mecca, as well as an imitation of the sandal of the Prophet and golden teacups. Smiling, she says, "Well, this is the reward of becoming a labor migrant." She wears a neat black t-shirt with glittering letters that read "Proud to be famous," as well as a thin golden necklace and matching earrings. She introduces me to her husband, who is wearing an "I Love Dubai" t-shirt. I learn from Ibu Tati, who has been working for 8 years in different Gulf states, in Kuwait, Oman, Saudi Arabia, and Dubai. When I inquire about Arab culture, she laughs and states that in her opinion, the Arabs were a bit narrow-minded and the women were very jealous. That's why they never allowed other men to see their wives and daughters. If a wife got jealous, then the graceful household maids from Indonesia had to wear a chador, a veil, even inside the house. These wives were often fed doing nothing except of eating and sleeping. They had no feeling of shame, malu, and no pride, letting themselves go like that. No, she had not liked Saudi Arabia much, but her time in Dubai had been great. That's where she bought some of the souvenirs and sent them back home. She would love to go back to Dubai for holiday. For now, they were trying to invest money from labor migration into bird breeding. Who knows, one day she might have a chance to show Dubai to her children. So this was a scene in Jawa Tengah, in Gunung Embun, and now a different scene from Madura, from the return of a respected Hajjah, who I call in the book Ibu Endang. In June 2014, I met Ibu Endang in the village of Ladang Tembakau in Madura. My companions and I waited for a while before the 40-year-old woman wearing a long black abaya, a traditional Arab dress, hurried towards the mushola we were sitting in. Ibu Endang waves towards us, indicating that she will join us in a while, rushing into the house next to the mushola. She returns with a tray of tea and apologizes for being late. There was a sick neighbor and she had to pray for her, she told us. Ibu Endang recounts that she worked in Saudi Arabia for almost 20 years, earning money for the well-being of her family, not seeing her children grow up, not even returning back home for her son's wedding. There had been a huge celebration when she returned home, of course. For years, she had sent earnings back home and her family had invested them in the children's education and in building a mushola we were sitting in. When I asked her how it feels to be back home after such a long time, she states that on the one hand, she feels strange in her own country and that she misses some things of life in Saudi Arabia. But then at the same time, she's happy to be back in Madura where she belongs. After all, the Arabs were a bit strange, she reflects. She was often embarrassed seeing Arab women dancing almost naked at wedding parties. They had no feeling of shame, of malu. These women, wasn't it haram to dance like that, even if it's in women-only areas? Officially, men and women are not allowed to talk and sit together in Saudi Arabia. Maybe that's because they don't know how to manage themselves, how to behave themselves. In Indonesia, people were free, but they knew their limits. They knew their morality. That's what she had told the employer's children, and she was sure that these children would love to see and live in Indonesia, where people were more sincere. Besides that, of course, it had been great that she was able to do the minor pilgrimage, the Umrah, every year, and she had done the Hajj 6 times. While on pilgrimage, she often met people from Madura, sent home clothes and pictures or dates and raisins through fellow Maduris. Now back home, she was teaching the Quran in evening gatherings and thanks to her excellent knowledge in Arabic, teaching the language to children in the nearby pesantren. So this is just one of the many examples that I discuss in the book, but it's an example that shows that what people make out of their experience is depending also very much on the context. So in Madura, there is a long tradition of pesantren, of religious education, and Arabness has a different capital in Madura. And then also there is a togetherness and a solidarity among the people of Madura that also support labor migrants when labor migrants are in Saudi Arabia. So not for, of course, there are also reports about abuse and exploitation also in Madura, But I found for many cases that it was like with Ibu Endang, that migration and pilgrimage were more mixed in Madura, and that a labor migrant was automatically also considered as a Ibu Haja or Pak Haji. Whereas in Jawa Tengah, it was not so easy to be acknowledged as a Hajja. There were not so many people asking Ibu Tati about having done the Hajj or having been to the Holy Land. She said that it was more separated. She didn't have access to the higher class, or there was not so much social upward mobility in terms of religious fulfillment or spirituality. And she was more in this role of a labor migrant and focusing on economic gain and investing the earnings from labor migration. So the question of being or not being a Hajja or accessing the capital of Arabness depends very much on the home context. It also depends on the different guiding discourses. If there is a plurality, let's say in Jawa Tengah, where there is also talk about East Asia, about Sesama Asia, in migration to Korea, for example. So there were more different guiding narratives from which women were choosing, whereas in Madura, it was a more stronger singular narrative about the Arab world as the holy place and the birthplace of Islam. So the guided mobility in many cases leads to a circulation. I found that even though people have been to the same place, they have done the same thing, they have both been labor migrants, the outcome depends very much on the home context. So a circulation of traveling norms, an anticipation of certain images, and also a continuity, like a reproduction of certain moral values. I found that this continuity is also supported through concepts like success, merantau as the search of success, what I said before, that people felt under pressure to live up to these expectations, and also a feeling of malu, of shame, and the belief in nasib, in destiny. I touch on the theory of Noel Salazar, who talks about mobility capital. What I said, that mobility in the end depends on what people can make of it, how they can make it meaningful in the return context, and also the theory of interpretative labor by David Graeber, who argues that people are never passive receivers. So if we talk, let's say, about Arabisasi, it's not something passive, and it's not like migrants and pilgrims go to Saudi Arabia and then there is a passive adoption of Arabness, but it is a very vibrant and complex process of what people can make out of it, how they can make their labor interpretative to, let's say, translate it into certain forms of capital. I'm slowly coming to the end. So this discussion is expanded further in the conclusion, where I discuss more generally the reasons for following a certain guidance or looking for other forms of guidance for cultural continuity or change, relating it back to the broader context in Indonesia with discussions about Arabisasi, of the preservation of indigenous traditions or changes in culture and tradition. I cannot give the full conclusion here. I hope that I triggered your curiosity to read into the book. Instead of giving away the conclusion, I want to give an outlook of another example, which is not my own example. So a few weeks ago, a friend of mine, Ray Yen, sent me this picture, or these pictures from Taiwan. And Ray Yen is also the photographer of the cover image of the book. So when I saw these pictures from Taiwan, it made me think, mungkin ada juga dunia Arab di Taiwan, tetapi dunia Arab punyanya Indonesia. So I think, I mean, this is a picture of Shaikh Armenia, of a community of TKI in Taiwan who meet and who also preserve cultural continuities and who engage with contemporary trends and discourses from Indonesia and continue them while being away from home. And I think that these examples of migrants in Taiwan, or as in the book, Migrants and Pilgrims in Saudi Arabia, shows these distinctive ways of engaging with symbolism, imagery, language, and spirituality that is being labeled as Arab. But this Arabness or Arabisasi does not necessarily derive from something that happens in contemporary Arab society. It's also not necessarily something that is related to ideology, to Wahhabism or Salafism. In some cases, it is more a symbolic capital that functions within the home context and the return context of people who become mobile, of migrants and pilgrims in the example of the book. So in many cases, I found that there is more cultural continuity in the engagement with Arabness rather than change, and that we need to differentiate very carefully when we talk about Arabisasi atau pengaruh dunia Arab di Indonesia. Of course, all of this is my interest in everyday life, in people who are not necessarily members of FPI, of Wahhabi or Salafism, but people in the broad everyday life. Good, so this is a small outlook into the conclusion. Last but not least, I want to emphasize that what was important about the research setting was the cooperation with research partners, and also the enthusiasm and the hospitality of research participants and hosts. A lot of people in Madura and Central Java who were very interested in this topic, who were very happy to talk to me, and especially 3 dedicated research partners, Nuki Mayasari, Khotim Ubaidillah, Ubit, and Kamalatul Khoiria, who helped me a lot in the research and also in the analysis, with a lot of discussions and also a lot of feedback on my writing. So that's the dedication of my book, and with this I'll end, and I'm looking forward to your questions and comments.
Okay, thank you so much, Mirjam. Terima kasih banyak. What's an interesting and huge research. Menarik sekali. Mungkin mungkin sedikit saya bukan merangkum ya, tetapi tadi sudah banyak yang diceritakan bahwa setidaknya ada 3 level comparison yang menjadi objek dari kajian Mirjam, yaitu tentang urban dan rural areas, kemudian tentang Madura dan Central Java dengan segala keunikan dan perspektif mereka tentang Arab world. Kemudian tentang hal lainnya tentu saja tentang migran dan TKW yang hijrah ke Arab Peninsula, tidak hanya di Arab Saudi, juga di Arab, ya Qatar, Kuwait dan seterusnya, dan juga pilgrim ya, orang yang berhaj pergi ke Amerika. Banyak hal di sini tentu saja teman-teman juga sudah mengikuti. Saya tidak akan mengulang. Tentu saja bisa bagaimana kemudian kita memahami koneksitas antara Indonesian Muslim tentu saja dan dunia Arab gitu. Dan ikatan itu tidak hanya sekarang, tentu saja sudah terjalin mungkin ratusan tahun lalu. Kita juga tahu bagaimana misalnya 2 organisasi besar NU Muhammadiyah itu para pendirinya juga belajar ke Arab. Jadi itu menjadi ikatan itu sudah sangat kuat. Mungkin kita bisa berdiskusi lebih lanjut tentang ini. Menarik sekali bicara tentang Madura juga. Mungkin ya Pak Samsul juga harus bertanya ya Pak, atau Pak Zamzam. Monggo you may raise your hand or bisa chat di sini, nanti saya bisa bacakan atau yang terkait dengan to know more about other detail about the research finding dan beberapa kemarin juga teman juga chat saya, Bu Mirjam, mereka ingin mendapatkan the PDF of the book gitu misalnya. Tapi saya belum mendapatkan tentu saja, dan kemudian mudah-mudahan segera sampai ke Indonesia. Mungkin teman-teman ada yang lebih detail untuk mengupas research finding atau temuan-temuan dari Mirjam di sini, atau apa yang menarik? Ada yang bisa raise your hand atau bisa langsung?
Halo Bu Witri.
Oh ya, monggo Pak Jarod, silakan. Ya.
Terima kasih Bu Witri.
Ya.
Terima kasih Bu, siapa namanya? Bu Mirjam ya?
Mirjam Lücking.
Ya, Bu Mirjam. Thank you for your clear lecture on your dissertation, your research. I think it's very interesting. I just want to know in detail what is actually you mean by the Arabization, and how do you measure that the culture is Arabized and this is not Arabized? And do you also use like how many years the migrant, Indonesian migrant, the Madurist migrant to Arabia, those who have influence in their village? Do you also discuss that in your research? And do you think that the same phenomena also applied in other area outside Madura and other area in Indonesia? Thank you, Ibu Witri and Ibu Mirjam.
Okay. Are you going to direct, or we have another? Are you going to answer directly?
Ya, bisa. Saya bisa jawab langsung. Saya juga lihat ada pertanyaan di chat, jadi mungkin saya bisa menjawab dua-duanya. Terima kasih banyak Pak Jarod. Saya coba, ya saya tidak tahu, mungkin saya coba menjawab dalam bahasa Indonesia supaya saya juga melatih bahasa Indonesia saya sedikit. Pertanyaan yang sangat baik Pak Jarod. Betul sekali, ada banyak sekali level atau tingkat perbandingan dalam penelitian saya, dan tentu saja ada dampaknya berapa lama mereka berada di sana, dan juga terutama dalam konteks Jawa Tengah ada banyak para TKW yang telah kerja di tempat yang beda-beda. Mereka mungkin beberapa tahun di Arab Saudi, setelah itu mereka di Dubai, setelah itu mereka bahkan di Korea atau di Hong Kong. Dan saya lihat itu pengaruh besar kalau mereka pergi ke tempat yang lain juga. So I see that it is very significant of how long people have been in that place, to how many different places they have been. Also in the example of the comparison between Arab Saudi and Dubai, because also in Dubai it's a very cosmopolitan environment where also the majikan tidak selalu orang Arab, ada banyak orang asing di Dubai. About the influence of Arab culture, so sebagai antropolog saya selalu lebih tertarik bagaimana mereka sendiri bicara tentang itu. So there is something in anthropology that we call the emic perspective, like the perspective of the people, and I was trying to understand in what context do people say Arab? Kapan mereka pakai kata itu Arab? Dan apa itu sebenarnya kalau kita bilang Arab? And I found that this is very complex and ambivalent, because sometimes people say itu ke-Arab-Arabannya, atau dia mengarabkan diri sendiri. But sometimes this is also talking about the dress code, about a certain style atau gaya pakaian, gaya berbahasa. So I found what I said before, that in many cases this is a more outward appearance or symbolic capital, and it's very difficult to measure. So I think it's very good that you ask how to measure this. I mean, I cannot really measure the Arab influence. I was more interested in how do people talk themselves about it, and when do they talk in a positive way about it. Itu bagian dari sunnah Nabi misalnya, or when is it in a more negative context, mengarabkan diri, like it has something that is more, why do you Arabize yourself, why do you not keep up with orang budaya lokal misalnya. So researching about these narrative and discourses, and also about other areas in Indonesia. I think that's very interesting, and unfortunately I could not cover it, so I only compare Madura and Jawa Tengah, and I found that it's a significant difference between Madura and Jawa Tengah, and this is a question in the chat, that there is a question by, I think, Pak Cristianto. Yeah, that if I want to say that being Haja is more important in Madura than in Jawa. And this is what I found. I mean, this is the examples that I found, but also Jawa is very, Pulau Jawa sendiri juga tidak monolithic. This was maybe in this village that I call Gunung Embung, near Salatiga. So in this village, I found that menjadi seorang haja, ibu haja, itu juga tergantung setiap orang pribadi. But secara umum, I found that it was not as present as in Madura. Whereas in Madura, itu sangat-sangat penting sekali. Dan in Madura ada beberapa kampung TKW yang ditinggal karena walaupun mereka sudah punya rumah, sudah bisa mendidik anak, masih harus merantau lagi sampai uangnya cukup untuk bisa pergi haji. Dan ada satu kampung namanya Batu Bintang di Madura, mungkin mereka yang dari Madura kenal kampung itu. Dan di Batu Bintang itu paling banyak hiasan haji, dan di setiap rumah ada hiasan haji, dan mereka sangat bangga mereka bisa pergi haji, dan itu sangat penting untuk kehidupan mereka, di mana tradisi pesantren, tradisi pelajaran Islam sangat kuat di Madura. So I found, yeah, this is the difference between Madura and Jawa Tengah in this case, but then again, of course, Java is also very diverse.
Terus kemudian ada, the others here, Chris still talk about, you wanna say that being more, what is the impact here dari Pak Zamzam? What is the impact of migrant works after returning to Indonesia related to their religious behavior or social style?
Yeah, so like I said, like in Madura, there was a lot of TKI selalu dipanggil Pak Haji. Mereka pakai peci putih sebagai simbol bahwa mereka sudah naik haji, dan mereka cukup dihormati. As I said before, so sometimes, as in this example that I gave of Ibu Endang, dalam kasus itu, ibu itu juga setelah pulang sebagai TKW, juga pulang sebagai ibu haja, menjadi ustazah di pesantren. Sangat dihargai dan dihormati. So I see that there was an influence of this in Madura, but in like I said, in Central Java, not so much. Yeah.
Okay. Is it like an ethnographic, and still from Cristianto, is it like an ethnographic study? How many informant that you deeply explore? Do you only meet them in Indonesia, or did also those still works there? I mean that.
Ya, so penelitian saya hanya di Indonesia. Saya fokus ke persiapan dan ritual-ritual dalam konteks pulang. So yeah, I was focused on the preparation and the return of migration and pilgrimage, and I did research mostly in these two villages that I nama samaran di buku Gunung Embung dan Ladang Tembakau. So mostly two villages in Pamekasan and in Jawa Tengah. And in these villages, I talked to a lot of people. So the ethnographic research was also to not only talk with one takeaway, but also with her family, with the neighbors, what is the overall context. So I think in Ladang Tembakau, I talked more deeply with like around 15, 17 labor migrants in Ladang Tembakau and with their families and surrounding with the Kepala Desa and the whole village community. And in Madura, it was mostly like 5 families, where in every family there was someone going on Hajj and coming back, and some people who did Umrah. But yeah, it's an ethnographic qualitative study, so the number is very small, and that's also why I cannot say something more generally about, let's say, other places in Java or other places in Indonesia.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, the other here from Toto Suharto. Orang Indonesia naik haji memiliki sejarah yang panjang. Menjelang kebangkitan Islam Indonesia yang ditandai dengan muncul organisasi-organisasi Islam di Indonesia. Ya, like I say, like Muhammadiyah, NU. Mereka naik haji bukan hanya faktor ibadah, tetapi juga mencari ilmu. Tetapi di Indonesia modern, motif ini telah berubah bagi orang naik haji. Bagaimana pergeseran ini terjadi? Mungkin perlu dijelaskan, sebab orang Indonesia ke Arab untuk belajar saat justru yang terjadi adalah penguatan konservatisme Islam Indonesia. You got the point, Mirjam? Okay.
Ya, terima kasih banyak. Pertanyaan yang baik sekali. Ya, itu yang juga bagian dari diskusi dalam buku saya, bahwa di Indonesia ada sejarah sekian lama, dan dari sudut pandang sejarah mungkin bukunya Michael Lafan sangat penting untuk mengerti sudut pandang sejarah dalam konteks itu, di mana Michael Lafan menulis bahwa para kiai atau ulama-ulama Indonesia yang pergi kuliah di tempat pelajaran agama Islam di Arab Saudi atau di Mesir, di Kairo, selalu punya ikatan yang kuat ke Indonesia. So in his book, Michael Lafan describes that mostly there were study circles of orang Jawa who stayed very much among the Javanese community, and who had long traditions of passing knowledge from one kiai to murid to another kiai. And he also says that through the journals that were published in that time, Seruan Azhar, for example, as a historical journal, there was also influence from Azharites back to Indonesia, to the independence movements. So maybe that's something more in the historical chapter and in the introduction, that of course in Indonesia there is also a strong ownership of these historical centers of Islam. And today, as it is formulated in the question today, it changes. And I think also what I don't discuss in the book is the role of students, orang yang kuliah hari ini di Arab Saudi, di Al-Qura, or in other universities, and also the influence of Saudi Arabian educational institutions in today's Indonesia, in universities that are being sponsored. So I think that's a different story, because that is really about the mindset and about certain teachings of Wahhabism. But what I found among para haji dan TKW, mereka tidak begitu tertarik dengan pelajaran itu. Ada satu informan saya, seorang Pak Haji yang memimpin rombongan haji, dan beliau sudah berkali-kali ke Mekah, dan beliau bilang, kalau kita naik haji ke Mekah, tentu saja kita selalu menerima buku. dan Arab Saudi sangat senang memberikan buku dan mereka menerjemahkan buku-buku pikiran Wahabi ke semua bahasa dan mereka mau menggunakan waktu haji untuk menyebarkan itu. Tetapi menurut informan itu ya, bukan pendapat saya, tetapi menurut informan saya, orang Indonesia lebih suka melihat buku itu dipasang saja. So to see the book on the bookshelf and the book looks nice, itu terlihat bagus. Tulisan Arab di situ, like the sampul looks nice, tetapi tidak begitu tertarik dengan kontennya. So what I didn't say before, selain TKW dan haji, saya juga banyak wawancarai pimpinan atau the persons who guide. That's why I say guided mobility. Dan menurut mereka, orang Indonesia dan orang Jawa, orang Madura sangat kuat dalam tradisi mereka. Dan kalau mereka pergi haji itu lebih dalam tradisi Indonesia. Dan juga karena di Indonesia itu jemaah haji yang terbesar di dunia. Dan ada rombongan, ada seragam batik. Bahkan kalau orang Indonesia pergi haji, mereka lebih menyadari tradisi mereka diri sendiri daripada mengambil sesuatu yang baru atau sesuatu dari tradisi Saudi atau tradisi Wahabi.
Oke, ya, tetapi pengaruh itu tetap ada ya, still.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Okay, there is also Subhani Dewi. Yeah, she's my friend from Sydney here. I want to ask 2 questions here. First, I'm curious about the role of descendants from a well-known scholar from Madura, Saihoni Khalil, in what you describe as a guided mobility, particularly in terms of Islamic knowledge or spirituality. What is that? Can you make a comment? Or Uma, are you going to explain more to make it clear here?
Yeah.
You may say. Okay.
Thank you, Bu Witri. Hi, Mirjam. Glad to see you here.
Hi, Bu Dewi.
Yeah.
When you said about Madura, I'm just curious about the well-known ulama from Madura, Shaykhana Khalil, who also have descendants right now, and the descendants also have a very good position both in religiosity and also even political position. So I'm just curious, do they also play a big role in this? What you describe as guided mobility, and do they have a specific, let's say, highlight, for example, in terms of spirituality? Because they are descendant of the well-known ulama. Even Thank you.
Terima kasih banyak Ibu, pertanyaan yang sangat baik. Ada bab tentang Shaykhuna Khalil juga di sini, dan saya beruntung sebagian kecil dari penelitian saya juga di pesantren Shaykhuna Khalil di Bangkalan. Dan sangat benar apa yang dikatakan oleh Ibu, bahwa tradisi Shaykhuna Khalil dan keturunannya sangat menguatkan negosiasi dengan budaya Arab di Madura. And this is also what I say about localizations, to make Arabness one's own. That di Madura ada banyak orang Madura yang bilang, kami juga memiliki dunia Arab. Itu tanah suci, tanah Nabi, dan kami sebagai keturunan itu terkait dengan Hadrami dan keturunan Nabi, kami secara alami punya hak untuk berada di situ, untuk berada di tanah suci. Dan di Madura itu sangat vibrant, it is very vibrant, and it's not the understanding that semuanya dari Arab itu hanya Wahabi itu hanya jelek, tetapi it's more ambivalent. There is a lot that is honored very much in the keturunan Shaykhuna Khalil, and the strong guiding role in public positions in the pesantren, also as you said in the political positions in Bangkalan especially, but also in the network of pesantren, not only in Madura, also in Jawa Timur. So I call this in the book the creative negotiation of Arabness, and this is also when I talked about the theory of David Graeber of interpretive labor, that it is not something passive, but it is something very active to negotiate Arab culture and customs, and to negotiate what is part of being Muslim, what is part of the Sunnat Nabi. And I found that I also talk about music in this context, that music is also an example how it can be very, very creative if we think of Sholawatan tradition in Madura, or also of more contemporary music. And there is even a music, an example that I like very much by a musician calling himself Al-Abror, who is playing a lot with gaya Arab dan gengsi gaya Arab, tetapi pada waktu yang sama lagu-lagunya menolak Wahhabisme. And it's, for example, one of the songs is called Makam Nabi Mau Dibongkar, talking about the Saudi Arabian plans of demolishing the Nabi's grave, as an understanding of this is shirk, people should not pray at the grave sites. And I found that this is a good example, both in the example of Shaykhuna Khalil and Keturunan Shaykhuna Khalil, but also contemporary music, that people can play with it. It's possible to take something of Arabness, ambil sebagian dari gaya Arab, tetapi at the same time, pada waktu yang sama, menolak pengajaran Wahabi. Ya, dan itu juga ada pertanyaan di chat tentang gengsi di Madura, bahwa tentu saja di Madura itu there is a mixture atau melange, ada campuran antara makna spiritual naik haji dan gengsi sosial, di mana perayaan Madura begitu besar kalau orang pulang dari tanah suci.
Yeah, jadi maybe it is related to how the practice of repeating pilgrimage to Mecca implied to social and cultural impact in both community. Haji 2 kali, haji 7 kali. Does it really relate with the cultural social impact here? Still.
Sebentar, sekali lagi saya tidak mengerti pertanyaan.
Yeah. Here she said that according to your study, how the practice of repeating pilgrimage to Mecca implies to social and cultural impact in both community. Let's say that those who come to Mecca, not only once, but twice, third, does it give any imply to the social and cultural impact in both community?
Ya, pertanyaan yang sangat baik juga. Itu juga karena ada perbandingan dalam buku, ada perbandingan antara like the rural area, daerah sedikit lebih terpencil, dan daerah kota, the urban areas. And my research partner Nuki Mayasari, pada waktu yang sama, waktu kita penelitian, Mbak Nuki menulis tesis S2 tentang budaya umroh di kota, in urban areas, terutama di kelompok antara wanita-wanita, antara ibu-ibu, kelompok ibu-ibu. And Nuki, my research partner, found that it's very much related to middle class identity also. Kalau orang bisa pergi berulang kali, bisa pergi haji atau umroh, lebih ke umroh ya, mau to umroh atau umroh plus juga, atau like more prestigious private travel agencies, that it is very much related to class identity, where there is a strong interest in spirituality and going to the holy sites, but there is also middle class identity of being able to afford this, and she found in her research that it goes a lot together with shopping, with consumption. So the talk of consumption and pilgrimage in this context.
Yes, of course, consumption.
Yeah.
Okay. Here from Ahmad Mulyadi, adakah pengaruh transfer ilmu di Arab dengan penyebaran Syiah atau paham Wahabi di Madura, atau mungkin radikalisasi khususnya di Madura? Maybe you have mentioned before, but are you going to explain more?
Ya, mungkin secara singkat saja. Ya, seperti saya bilang, yang saya lihat di antara TKW dan para haji secara umum, di situ ilmu budaya Arab tidak begitu penting. Kalau antara mereka yang lebih penting adalah konteks lokal. Bagaimana mereka naik status setelah pulang, tetapi tentu saja itu selalu ada pengaruh. Cuman yang saya melihat pengaruh itu lebih di bidang pendidikan. Kalau misalnya ada beasiswa untuk pergi kuliah di Arab Saudi, atau mungkin ada ulama Wahabi yang diundang ke Indonesia yang mengajar di situ, dan itu lebih di bidang pendidikan dan tidak begitu banyak antara rombongan para haji atau TKW.
Okay. Okay, thank you so much. Now there is one more question, but in Arabic. Pak Zamzam, explain it in bahasa or in English. Or you got it, Mirjam?
Ya, ini pertanyaan yang ditulis dalam bahasa Arab itu mengenai gelar, ya, gelar. Kalau orang Indonesia atau orang Malaysia pulang haji, mereka pulang punya gelar seperti Pak Haji, Ibu Haja, sebagai gelar hormatan. Dan ada pertanyaan di sini, apakah itu juga ada di misalnya di negara yang lain atau di Eropa, ya, kalau saya mengerti dengan baik. Itu menarik sekali.
Di Eropa juga ada.
Jadi ini menarik. Karena sekarang saya tinggal di Palestina, saya lihat bahwa kalau misalnya di Palestina itu juga ada hiasan di rumah kalau seorang pulang. Dan kalau di masyarakat Palestina itu juga ada gelar Pak Haji atau Ibu Haja sebagai gelar hormatan. Kadang-kadang juga kalau orang lebih tua, kita bilang saja, ya, kita pakai gelar itu walaupun juga kita tidak tahu mereka sudah naik haji atau belum, tetapi it becomes like a term of honor. Okay. Dan sama juga di Jerman. Kalau di Jerman antara teman-teman Turki, teman-teman dari Suriah, mereka juga sama seperti itu.
Gitu ya.
Ya.
Di sini jadi gelar akademik juga bahkan di UIN. Haji. Okay. Is there more questions? Ada lagi Bapak Ibu yang akan ditanyakan? We still have 7 minutes. Oh, orang Madura. Oh ya, ini ada Pak Samsul, orang Madura dia. Orang Madura naik haji bukan hanya sekedar menjalankan perintah agama, tetapi juga untuk menaikkan status sosial, ya, like we said before. Perayaan untuk menyambut orang pulang haji nggak ada semeriah di Madura. Oh, it is a statement from orang Madura. Jadi ya.
Betul, ya.
Okay, betul.
Iya, betul sekali yang dibilang Pak Syamsul, ya. Dan itu juga bagian sangat menarik dalam penelitian saya saat bukan hanya acara pulang, tetapi juga acara untuk pemberangkatan, di mana saya boleh ikut rombongan para seorang ibu dan bapak yang mau naik haji, dan kami antar mereka pakai rombongan 10 mobil, dan kami mengantarkan mereka sampai ke Pamekasan. Ya, itu sangat meriah. Dan di Pamekasan, di pusat kota, itu seperti pesta rakyat. Ada banyak, semua orang datang dari semua kampung, mengantar ya calon haji, ada makanan, ada snack, ada balon, ada anak-anak lari, ada orang sangat merayakan itu bahwa ada yang bisa naik haji. Dan saat pulang juga, itu yang gambar yang tadi ada di PowerPoint, saat pulang ada juga perayaan yang melibatkan semua orang, supaya bukan hanya yang pergi haji bisa senang sudah naik haji, tetapi rakyat dan masyarakat komunitas desa juga ikut merayakannya.
Menarik ya. Ada yang menarik tentang tradisi ini, saya belum baca risetnya sih. Memang katanya orang Madura yang di Arab Saudi itu bahkan banyak yang tidak bisa berbahasa Indonesia gitu. Bahkan kalau mereka harus kursus ke KBRI untuk belajar berbahasa Indonesia, bisanya berbahasa Arab kemudian Madura, dan itu menjadi
jangan
komunitas.
begitulah.
Iya, ada itu menarik sekali. That's very interesting.
Oke, itu beberapa abad yang lalu mungkin.
Bisa jadi. Oke, artinya ikatan itu lebih ini ya, close ya, antara Madura dengan Arab world gitu loh. And their Arab world gitu ya. Oke. Oke. Ada lagi mungkin Bapak Ibu? Kalau tidak, we still have 5 minutes. Is there anything you wanna is there any close statement or something, Mirjam? Or anything?
Mungkin hanya sebagai kesimpulan atau untuk mengulangnya lagi, to sum it up, is that I found that interaksi dengan dunia Arab itu begitu beragam di Indonesia, dan contoh dari Madura itu mungkin juga paling terkesan bagi saya, bahwa di Madura itu bisa ada ikatan dengan dunia Arab yang istimewa, dan itu juga bisa menjadi sumber kebanggaan, tetapi itu beda dengan pengaruh ideologi. Itu kalau ada gengsi Arab atau simbol-simbol budaya Arab di Madura, itu kita tidak otomatis bisa pikir itu identik dengan pengaruh ideologi Wahabi atau Salafi. Itu masih beda, dan itu kebanggaan orang Madura sendiri atau versi Arab yang ada di Madura, yang dinegosiasi di Madura. So that's what I mean with guided mobility, that there is a mobility, there is something changing, but it is very guided, and this guidance still happens in the logic of the home context, logika di konteks lokal. Ya, itu saja.
Very interesting. Ya, terima kasih banyak Mirjam. Thank you so much for a very interesting book. Yeah, hopefully we can have it in Indonesia soon to read well, and at least the PDF. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, kita mungkin before we close, I think we need to take photos like usual. Please everybody turn on your camera, please. Nah, Pak Zamzam jadi kelihatan sekarang, jadi ganteng itu.
Paling besar.
Oke. Ada berapa slide, Mbak Panitia?
Okay.
Mungkin perlu diaba-aba ya. Halo?
Di unpin, Mbak.
Oke.
Kameranya nggak ada.
Mana kameranya? Tadi sudah di shoot belum ya?
Sudah ya, Mbak?
Sudah.
Okay. Sudah? Oke. Okay. Sudahkah? Supposed to be. Harusnya sudah ya? Atau Pak Wildan sudah? Oke.
Sudah.
Oke. Okay.
Wa syukran ya Sayyidah Mirjam. Ada muhadratikal qayyimah hadzal yawm.
Aduh, udah
very much for your
Kalangkong.
Matur sakalangkong.
Oke, same-same.
Oke, sabalika.
Okay.
Wow, ada yang pasti bahasa Arab di sini.
Mungkin ini sekalian ini ya Pak Bu Mirjam, kita punya jurnal Sunan Kalijaga, International Sunan Kalijaga International Journal for Islamic Civilization. Ya mungkin suatu saat bisa kita minta bantuan sebagai reviewer, beberapa it's in English. Oke, atau
dengan senang hati.
Atau kita mengharapkan bisa menulis di jurnal kita.
Dua-duanya.
Dua-duanya. National, iya, in both, ya.
Baru jadi reviewer.
Ya, jadi reviewer dulu ya. Ya, it's related. You talk much about Indonesia and Islam also, and I think that's very interesting.
Ya, terima kasih banyak, syukran kecil, Matur Sakalangkong, sangat senang boleh berdiskusi dan bicara. Hatur nuwun.
Okay, thank you so much.
Tapi nggak sampai semenap. Coba ke semenap lebih menarik lagi mungkin ya.
Iya.
Betul. Itu semenap itu lebih ada cerita lain lagi. Ya.
Semenap itu kampung saya.
Iya.
Okay. Ya. Thank you so much. Ya, terima kasih sekali Mirjam about all this and also all the participant for this presentation. And then this is a bi-weekly forum from Adab Faculty and Cultural Science, and then we can close this forum with hamdalah bersama-sama. Alhamdulillahirabbil alamin.
Alhamdulillahirabbil alamin.
Sampai bertemu di 2 minggu mendatang dengan acara yang berbeda, dengan forum yang sama tentu saja. Terima kasih atas kehadiran Bapak Ibu dalam diskusi kali ini. Saya pamit, mohon maaf jika ada kesalahan. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Ini cara dapat bukunya gimana ini?
Ada hasil penelitiannya yang berbahasa Indonesia ya Mbak Wid?
Gimana Mbak Rahima? Oh ini dari Surabaya. Gimana Mbak?
Ada hasil penelitiannya yang berbahasa Indonesia?
Apa sirupnya?
Memudahkan mengerti apa yang dihasilkan.
Iya, objeknya tentang Indonesia, tapi diterbitkan di Cornell di luar gitu. Tapi banyak di sana.
Kan sudah diselenggarakan.
Is it? Yeah, we hope that there is a translation version of the book, Mirjam.
Semoga
ya. Yeah, from into bahasa to make it or to Madura.
Atau bahasa Madura.
Siap menerjemahkan.
Oke.
Semoga akan ada.
Oke, matur sekelangkong.
Sekelangkong.
Bu Rahima dari Madura juga kah? Enggak ya? Jawa Timur aja.
Orang Madura, saya asli Lamongan.
Oke.
Cuma perlu diteliti juga mungkin tentang
Rahimah dari Malang.
perempuan Madura.
UIN Madura.
UIN Sunan Ampel.
Sunan Ampel. Saya pernah ketemu.
Halo.
Oke.
Mbak Mirjam tuh pernah ke Fakultas Adab tahun berapa itu Mbak Mirjam ya?
Tahun 2019 mungkin?
Kan 2017 ya, 17 atau
ya, sama juga. Ya, betul.
Dulu presentasi juga tentang penelitian Mirjam tentang orang-orang Indonesia yang ziarah ke Yerusalem.
Iya, betul.
Nah, ini sekarang penelitiannya masih berjalan. Sudah ada buku atau artikel di situ?
Ada artikel, belum ada buku. Ya, itu penelitian masih berjalan. Penelitian tentang ziarah Al-Aqsa dan juga wisata rohani orang Kristen Katolik dari Indonesia dan Malaysia. Karena ada dua-duanya, ada ziarah Al-Aqsa dan ada yang namanya wisata rohani, Holy Land Pilgrimage. Dan itu menarik sekali juga, cuman untuk sementara belum dilanjut karena tidak ada wisata untuk sementara.
Iya.
Semoga bisa dilanjut setelah pandemik
Itu menarik loh.
Ya, menarik.
Saya pernah punya teman pendeta, Mirjam. Beliau habis umroh, mereka sebutnya umroh. Kemudian saya pulang-pulang saya dibelikan tas kulit Jerusalem, tulisannya Jerusalem, tetapi ada gambar bintang dan bulan itu. Jadi, Witri, this supposed to be for Islam katanya. Jadi Islam, tetapi ada kemudian ke Jordan, ke lain-lain. Jadi
betul.
Interesting. Jadi ikatan agama itu menjadi sangat kuat gitu loh.
Betul. Dan saya lihat banyak itu kemarin sebelum pandemik, waktu saya menemani rombongan Kristen Katolik, banyak yang bilang, oh ini saya mau beli kenang-kenangan, saya mau beli oleh-oleh untuk teman-teman yang Muslim. Dan mereka cari yang ada gambarnya Al-Aqsa seperti itu.
Al-Aqsa, iya. Interesting. Okay. So you are here now in Jerusalem or in Germany? Sekarang di Jerusalem.
Ya.
Oke.
Lagi dingin, ada salju.
Oh ya.
Kemarin di Madura berapa bulan, Mirjam?
Setengah tahun.
Wah, lumayan.
Ya, lumayan lama. Tapi bolak-balik juga, bolak-balik ke Jogja, ke Madura.
Tapi sudah sampai Sumeneb.
Nyampe Sumeneb, sampai juga berkunjung ke Asta Tinggi, ke Keraton Sumeneb.
Oke. Oh, iya.
Menarik sekali.
Ya. Oke, terima kasih.
Sekarang sudah ada pesawat ya di Sumeneb.
Sumeneb Kepulauan udah nyampe?
Belum. Sayang sekali belum.
Oh.
Bu Mirjam harus kali-kali ke Cirebon nih, penelitian di Cirebon, Bu.
Oh ya, saya belum pernah ke Cirebon.
Ini Pak Dekan langsung lihat. Saya kebetulan alumni Jogja. Di Cirebon menarik, Bu Mirjam. Karena ada satu kota itu dengan 4 keraton. Ada Kanoman, ada Kesepuhan, ada Keprabonan, ada Kecirebonan. Dan naskahnya sangat banyak kalau untuk mau diteliti.
Ya, menarik.
Oh, dia peneliti yang Indonesia.
Semoga bisa ke sana dalam waktu dekat.
Iya, salah satu hal yang menarik mungkin tentang Syekh Siti Jenar.
Iya, saya dengar itu ya.
Iya, yang ini yang sedang saya teliti juga berkenaan dengan hal-hal yang menarik. Ternyata banyak versi, banyak data-data baru. Itu Pak Bu Mirjam.
Menarik sekali.
Oke.
Ya.
Ya, thank you. Saya live ya. Oke.
Terima kasih banyak ya.
Terima kasih banyak.
Saya minta maaf dan semoga bisa bertemu dalam waktu dekat di Jogja atau di Yerusalem.
Oke, siap. Atau di Madura nanti.
Atau Madura. Oke. Bye.
Oke. Assalamualaikum. Nice.
Waalaikumsalam.
Terima kasih semuanya.
Terima kasih Pak Dekan semuanya.
Ya, terima kasih Pak Dekan. Live. Oh, ini mikrofonnya juga.